Today's mobster is a man who went from being a soldier in the Genovese crime family to becoming an FBI informant. He was the man who brought down one of the most powerful crime bosses of all time. This is the story of Sammy Gravano. Sammy grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s. His father ran a numbers racket, and his brother was a capo in the Colombo crime family. So it wasn't surprising when Sammy got involved with organized crime. When he was just 18 years old, he joined the Genovese crime family and became a soldier under Joe Colombo. For the next decade, he committed crimes for the family. But we don't know what they were, because it's not public knowledge. It was only after he became an informant that the FBI started keeping tabs on him. In 1984, the FBI sent an undercover agent to infiltrate the Genovese crime family. His name was Joseph Pistone. Over the next 6 years, he rose through the ranks and even got to befriend the boss of the family, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. But this wasn't an easy task. Salerno distrusted outsiders and kept him at arm's length for most of their relationship. However, Pistone befriended many other high-ranking members, including Sammy Gravano. The two of them hit it off right away and became close friends. Sammy trusted Joseph so much that he took him under his wing and began teaching him the tricks of the trade. Since he'd been in the business for almost 20 years by that point, he knew every restaurant and bar in the city that had mob connections. Joseph would go to these places and scope them out while Sammy stayed in the car waiting for him. In fact, there was nothing Joseph did that Sammy didn't school him on. Soon he was like a little brother to Sammy. However, the FBI had no idea that Sammy was teaching Joseph. They were only watching Joseph and assumed that he was teaching Sammy how to become a mobster. Everything changed when Fat Tony was arrested in a massive FBI sting operation called Operation Pizza Connection. They busted over 60 mobsters that day, including Joseph. At first, Sammy tried to stay loyal and visited his friend in prison. But he quickly realized that life as a mobster wasn't worth it. This included racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, drug trafficking, and murder. He gave up all his mobster friends, including Fat Tony. He also testified against them in court and helped put many of them behind bars. However, he didn't testify against everyone. There were some mobsters he didn't like and saw as enemies. One of them was his former boss, Joe Colombo. In 1991, Colombo was indicted on racketeering charges. The feds thought Sammy would testify against him, but he refused. A few months later, Colombo was released on bail, and soon after he left the country. However, the judge revoked his bail, and Colombo was arrested. At the same time, Sammy was driving home one night when 4 men in ski masks jumped him. They beat him with wooden bats and left him for dead. Sammy survived, but couldn't speak for weeks. Everyone thought his attackers were Colombo's men, but it wasn't clear why they attacked him, since he hadn't testified against him yet. Maybe they wanted to send him a message, or maybe they were trying to kill him before he could testify. I don't know for sure. In the meantime, Colombo's trial was coming up, and the prosecution needed Sammy to testify against him, but he still refused. That's when the FBI decided to intervene, and they brought Sammy to a secret location. They put him in witness protection and forced him to testify. To this day, Sammy says he hated living in witness protection and hated that the FBI forced him to testify. He said the people in witness protection weren't the worst criminals, and that the FBI should have done more to help him. He also said that the FBI wouldn't let him testify over the phone or from another state, which was a mistake. He said if they let him do it over the phone, Joe Colombo wouldn't have been convicted. After giving his testimony, Sammy returned to his normal life, but it wasn't the same. He was always looking over his shoulder, wondering if someone was following him. He also had nightmares about being beaten up again. However, he never went back to his old life. Instead, he reinvented himself and tried to make an honest living. He opened a car dealership and worked as a used car salesman. However, his past always seemed to come back and haunt him. In 1997, Fat Tony was released from prison and returned to his lavish lifestyle. Soon after, Sammy was hanging out with Fat Tony again, and people started to wonder if he'd become an undercover mobster. However, that wasn't the case. Sammy was actually working as an informant again, this time for the Gambino crime family. He helped them take down Fat Tony once and for all. In 2002, Fat Tony was given a 100-year sentence for racketeering. But it was long before he got sick with cancer and died in prison just 3 years later. Around this time, Sammy realized that he'd made a big mistake. He told the FBI everything he knew about the Genovese crime family, but he never told them anything about the Gambino crime family. He thought that if he gave up the Gambino family, they'd put him in witness protection again, but he was wrong. They just gave him another choice. They told him he could either testify against the Gambinos or face criminal charges himself. At this point, Sammy had no choice. He'd already given up his old friends and couldn't go back to that life, so he agreed to testify. He gave up many of the Gambino crime family's secrets, including information about John Gotti. In 2008, Sammy was back in court testifying against mobsters. It was like old times. However, this time he was on the other side. Now that he'd given up both the Genovese and Gambino families, Sammy expected the FBI to protect him, but they didn't. They believed they'd thrown him under the bus and abandoned him. And in a way, they had. They didn't want Sammy getting hurt, so they decided not to protect him. Instead, they hoped that the mob would leave him alone now that he'd given up so much information. But the mob didn't forget about Sammy. Just a few months after he testified against the Gambinos, he was beaten up again. This time he had to be hospitalized. Everyone knew that the Gambinos were behind the attack, but no one could prove it. So they let Sammy out of the hospital and sent him back to his normal life. Now, Sammy was terrified. He couldn't believe the mob was still after him after all this time. He tried to carry on like normal, but he was too scared to leave his house. Eventually, he had to move in with his sister in Staten Island. However, the mob wasn't done with him yet. In 2011, Sammy got a threatening letter from the Bonanno crime family. It must have been tough to be a mobster back in the day. Imagine having to write a threatening letter instead of just sending a text message. Anyways, the Bonanno family was mad at Sammy for testifying against their rival families. It seems they considered him an enemy, just like Columbo. In the letter, they threatened to harm his family if he didn't apologize for what he did. Sammy was terrified, but he wasn't going to apologize. Instead, he went straight to the FBI and told them about the letter. They took it seriously and promised to protect him and his family. Since then, he's lived a quiet life away from the mob. He's never gotten married or had kids, but he seems happy. He likes fishing and spending time with his friends. He's also written 2 books about his life as a mobster. These days, Sammy is in his 70s and has spent half his life in the mob. Looking back, he says he regrets everything he did. He knows he hurt a lot of people and can never take that back. However, he hopes that one day they can forgive him. Now it's time to hear from you. What do you think about Sammy Gravano? Let me know in the comments below. Also make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. That's all for this video. I'll catch you guys next time.